So I'm Simon. I'm one of the founders of Proxy, and I'll kind of remind everyone what we're building uh, in case you haven't seen the previous presentation, and then talk a little bit about the steps we're currently taking to ensure some hardware integrity and authenticity checks. So we're a hardware plus software kind of shop. And the primary product is a wallet, a user custody wallet for digital identity documents, digital assets. Primarily that's key management, but it also includes seeds and keys for your crypto wallets, as well as your driver's license, FIDO authenticator, other sort of identity and authentication use cases like that. And our main focus is on making a product that's easy to use, has safe, good enough defaults so that users can't hold it wrong. The goal here is to make some of this really cool technology that we are all very familiar with accessible to the next 100 million people. How do we make sure that it's easy to use, it's understandable, and it can't be accidentally misused? Part of this suite, in addition to a software mobile wallet, we're making a wearable hardware wallet that acts as a companion to the software application. It can be a co-signer in multi-sig transactions. It can also be a single signer, but that's not a use case that we're sort of focused on, because that opens up a lot of tricky situations, but mostly focusing on it acting as a co-signer, and it can also participate in wallet recovery. The form factor is a ring, so extremely constrained in terms of size and power. Just a little disclaimer that this is on release, so all of this can change at any time, but it's kind of plan of record. So primarily I will talk about the hardware pieces. We have an MCU with a built-in Bluetooth stack, Bluetooth core, and that's all of these are off-the-shelf components. This is not custom silicon. We have a secure element with an integrated NFC front end and an antenna, and we have a few sensors, capacitive sensors, force input, and fingerprint biometrics as an optional feature as well. And we use a fusion of these sensors to provide active wearer detection and lock down the device when it comes off your hand and things like that. Secure element keeps user secrets. It also keeps component auth codes, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Provides the usual secure element things, resistance to side channel attacks, etc. It's pretty much the only place where we store any user secrets. And we're also using it as a TRNG source. And yeah, as I mentioned, extremely constrained form factor. We're packing all of this into tiny volume, so there isn't really a lot of board space, physical volume space, or power. It's pretty tight in there. Just a high-level system perspective on security. Obviously, not just the hardware components themselves, but as we had mentioned before, the entire system has to operate as one unit. Pretty much the only secure input-output we have is via NFC. NFC radio is directly integrated with the secure element. It is not accessible to the MCU at all. There's physically no way for the MCU to intercept any of that communication. And as far as Bluetooth goes, we use Bluetooth as a transparent transport for the same NFC APDUs. So there's no, it's still the exact same secure channel that's being established end-to-end between the mobile app and the secure element. Bluetooth is also used for a couple of auxiliary things like loading firmware updates and other kind of high bandwidth use cases, which are not transaction critical. But as far as regular operation, it's just a transparent envelope. And the secure element itself isolates our applets from any of the sort of pre-installed from any other pre-installed applets which provide payment functionality, and some of the other common NFC use cases which are not ours but are also on the device as a feature set. So some of the things we use to ensure that all the components which are in a piece of hardware that you receive is bind these components together with keys generated from physical unclonable functions on a couple of these components. And the important components, again, are basically the MCU, secure element, and the fingerprint sensor, as far as we're concerned. So if people aren't familiar with these physical unclonable functions, it's generally some property that's derived from the physical structure of the silicon itself. It goes out to be unique and unclonable. It's immutable per chip, and has some nice advantages where these per device keys don't need to be programmed. So there's few opportunities to intercept or sort of man in the middle this root key programming. And the key doesn't exist anywhere when the power is off. The key is effectively regenerated each time it's used from the physical hardware itself. And we use these to derive other keys, as you'll see in a sec. So at manufacturing time, we capture the generated, they're called authentication codes from these path functions, and we store them in a secure element. The secure element is the only sort of secure storage on the device. It's the only one that's resistant to physical attacks and resistant to offline readouts. So that's where we store these auth codes. It's a one-time write to the secure element, and they can be read out freely, but they can't be updated again. And then at runtime, we use these auth codes to reconstruct the key using the physical properties, and then derive actual session keys or encryption keys or whatever from that. Obviously, you want to minimize the amount of time the reconstructed key ever exists in memory, so it's only done very briefly, and then the reconstructed key is nuked again once you've derived the session keys. And effectively, this bonds together the MCU, the secure element, and the fingerprint components in such a way that they're basically permanently paired. Here's some of the places where these are used. From the MCU, we key wrap bus encryption keys, which are used to communicate between the MCU and the secure element. So that's a secure channel protocol, SCP-03 specifically, and that's those keys are established actually at user personalization time, not at manufacturing time, but they're key wrapped using this path key. And similarly, MCU to fingerprint image capture data, both for enrollment and for matching, is encrypted on the bus. Bus comms is something that is generally the weak point of a lot of devices which are composed of multiple components. It's the easiest to intercept. Just put a couple of probes. You can usually dig up the traces for USPI or I2C bus. That's the easiest ones. So encrypting everything that goes over memory buses or comms buses is pretty important. And also we use this to encrypt sensitive data in Flash, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. From the fingerprint sensor side, again, the exact same bus comms encryption. So swapping out any of these components effectively breaks the communication with that component. So if you one of the common attack vectors that we've seen done, if you can't compromise the the code or inject code running on the MCU, for example, you can instead just take the MCU off and replace it with a different one that already has compromised code on it. So this sort of setup prevents that exact vector. And it can also be used as part of a more composite authenticity check because you can use it to mutually auth all the components and do an authenticity check, not just on the secure element or one of the components, but actually confirm that all the critical components of the system are still the same ones that were placed there at manufacture time. A little bit on the software or firmware integrity. A lot of this is pretty standard stuff because we use off-the-shelf components, so we don't have a lot of freedom in customizing this, unfortunately, and that's one of the hopes for discussions like these. But the bootloader is our own. We don't use the chip-provided bootloader because it doesn't have the functionality that we want it to have. But this is our own bootloader that will only accept assigned images. It has downgrade protection and things like that, and standard MCU memory protection, disabling debugger interface. All of those things apply. Of course, they are not guarantees. There've been plenty of glitching attacks and things like that that have allowed MCU memory protection to be removed and debugger interfaces to be not always re-enabled, but at least used to dump memory, for example, from a supposedly protected chip. So these are definitely not the strongest points there, and they're the things that could potentially be improved. And the secure applets themselves, the secure element applets themselves, we wanted to make sure that those are field upgradable. Quite commonly, they're not, because of how a lot of the Java card-based secure elements work, where the data is part of the applet. So once your applet is personalized and you've loaded some user data, some keys on there, you effectively can't upgrade that applet because removing that applet will wipe all that user information. We've separated our applets into essentially business logic versus user data storage, and the user data storage applet is extremely simple, but all it does is store the data, and that one's not field upgradable, but all the logic is field upgradable, so we can fix bugs and vulnerabilities and things like that. And yeah, of course, the applets themselves, the load files are assigned. Device authenticity check is still a bit of a work in progress, so I'll talk about it very briefly. But at manufacture time, you can, from previous information, probably already gather that we can register a generated key from the secure element, as well as the collected authentication codes from all the other peripherals. We'll basically register those, store them on our backend. And then upon receiving a device, a user can scan it with their phone over NFC, issue a challenge, and read back a signature cryptogram that can be verified as a device that was manufactured by us effectively, and not a clone and not a substituted device. And finally, I'll wrap up with a couple of points that I think, let's say, I'm not entirely happy with. Secure code integrity checks, as I mentioned, a lot of the MCU code verification relies on code running on the MCU itself. A lot of this is subject to silicon vendor bugs, glitch attacks, etc. I don't know if there is a way to make this better without having a fully integrated system like the ones we saw presented before. But ultimately, this is often a weak point of many of these things. So for us, the less reliance we have on the authenticity of the MCU code, the better, just because of these reasons. But it can't be completely removed, let's say. And ideally, I would like the code integrity checks to participate in device authenticity verification as well. So not only have you verified that the components are still the same, but you could verify the hash of your bootloader code, for example, and be able to do that in a way that doesn't depend on that code itself. Transparent encryption of memory reads and writes. This is kind of a big one that would be really useful. Right now, we're doing this manually and only for some data that we consider sensitive, like biometric templates. It means we actually need to read the data and then decrypt it ourselves. We can't sort of DMA it between different components directly. External memory controller or on-chip memory controllers, which provide for transparent block encryption of memory reads and writes would be absolutely awesome. Physical temp evidence is something we're also looking at in terms of making transparent inner housing, as well as etching things on it. But that's a work in progress. And finally, authenticity check using Web Bluetooth and Web NFC directly from the browser, so you're not relying on an app that you can't inspect, and you can leverage TLS connections to a known web server would also be awesome. This is actually possible right now with mobile Chrome, which is really cool, but it only kind of works in Chrome, unfortunately. It would be great to have that in other places. So that's all I have for now.